Thanks for coming out to hang out with me for an hour or so on this lovely fall day. Actually, yesterday was a lovely day, but I was preparing yesterday. I thought I should say it's a lovely day. It's almost a lovely day, but it's really great for me to be here. I've been a big fan of the Cultural Policy Center for, wow, since late last century when I first became aware of the work going on here. And so it was a real thrill and honor to be invited, so I really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk to you about the Human Knowledge Project. The Human Knowledge Project is the title of the last chapter of my book, The Googleization of Everything, which came out in 2011. I capped it off with this idea, this sort of map of what a human knowledge project might be. And of course, now you're saying, what the heck are we talking about? And I'll get to it. And I did that because so often in scholarly and critical books, the easiest criticism of said books is, so what next? You know, what do you want us to do with all of this? And so I thought, well, the best thing strategically for me to do is present a vision of what we could do, what we should do, that was so thoroughly unrealizable that I would escape the initial criticism and yet not have to be held accountable for failing to actually accomplish it. And so that's kind of what I thought of with the Human Knowledge Project. As you'll see, it is a big picture, big idea. But it's I think it's inspired by a number of very practical and doable experiments, and inspired by a very long tradition of trying to imagine better ways to connect more people with better information in a more usable form. Sort of what we do at universities, certainly what we do in the library world, and what has informed much of the highfalutin rhetoric coming out of Silicon Valley, but of course it doesn't start or end there. Now, the Human Knowledge Project was inspired as a reaction to what I found to be a baffling move, a baffling event. December 2004, news broke. News broke that Google had entered into a partnership with the University of Michigan Libraries, along with Harvard University, Stanford University, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, the New York Public Library. And the plan was, and to some degree still is, to scan in millions of books to Google servers and offer sophisticated, textually based search of these books, and offer them to general readers and searchers in a variety of forms. The plan being for public domain works, or at least works that Google could reasonably assume were public domain, anything published before 1923, at least in the US, different ages for different parts of the world. Those works would be made fully available through Google's services. And then for post-1923 works, there would be this whole patchwork of levels of availability. Works that had been appropriately licensed from copyright holders would or might be available in full form, or maybe in a restricted number of pages per view form, depending on a deal that Google might establish with the copyright holder, publisher, author, or otherwise. But for most of the works for which Google would not enter such a deal, the works would be available in what was known as snippet form. So you would do a keyword and context search, and the string of text would appear at certain places in the book, and you would see the page numbers and the bibliographic information if it was available and complete, and you would see the snippet of the text around which you were searching, and it might give you some clue that this book had taken seriously the keywords you were searching, or maybe not. Now, this, of course, started a massive reaction among publishers, because publishers had, for a number of years, been working on a series of deals with Google through which publishers thought Google would have such a service that would really serve their interests primarily, and Google's interests, but would be done on their terms. And they were shocked to see that Google was audaciously scanning in these books many of which they controlled, but many of which they did not, without permission. Now, Google's argument, of course, its copyright argument, was that by presenting only the keywords in context, the snippet form of the works most likely to be under copyright, they weren't really infringing. They were focusing on the user experience, and the user experience was far less than the entire text. And so there really is nothing to worry about in copyright terms from Google's point of view. From the publisher's point of view, publishers said, but wait a minute, you're scanning in the entire work. You're scanning in the entire work for a commercial service. It's wholesale scanning. There's no particular fair use argument you can make in any sophisticated way about each individual work. You know, you're making a collective generalization about how fair use works. So this is, you know, this is straight up infringement. The minute you're scanning stuff in, you know, Google, big rich company scanning stuff in. So that was where the copyright argument laid out, and it's where the copyright argument actually kind of still is. There were hearings a few months ago in the Southern District of New York about these very issues. And so we really don't have a definitive answer on the level of liability, if any, that Google has for the scanning of these millions of books. And you know, we might never get a definitive answer, but that's because the story since 2004 has gotten really complicated. There was a settlement for a while that the judge in the case ended up rejecting for a number of reasons that Randy Picker, I'm sure, went into in his talk in some depth. And that's all a pretty fascinating story, and much of it, but not all of it, is recounted in my book. My book, unfortunately, came out just before the judge rejected the settlement, which kept me scrambling. It gave me a nice publicity boost at the very moment, but it meant a significant portion of the book was instantly irrelevant. Nonetheless, the very act was what I wanted to focus on. The audacity of the act is really what I wanted to focus on. Because December 2004, Google was 6 years old. Google was 6 years old, and you know, remember, companies usually don't last that long. Silicon Valley companies usually don't last 6 years. Google had obviously managed to do something very special, and by 2004, we knew it was exceptional. We knew it was huge. We knew it was potentially rich, although it wasn't yet actually rich. It was about to be. But you know, by 2004, there's no ignoring the fact that Google had allowed us to manage the web in ways that no previous company had done or even thought possible. So by 2004, Google was riding high in terms of reputation for technological prowess, reputation for good corporate citizenship, reputation for being a great place to work, reputation for thinking big and doing cool things. And it had been developing a reputation for defending fair use rights and other users' rights in terms of copyright. So those of us who were critics of what we saw as pretty bold copyright extremism coming out of the 90s had been cheering on Google's what we thought of as high-minded efforts to allow for more reasonable copyright in America. But in this case, Google's audacity was really striking, because you had the University of Michigan and Oxford University and Harvard and Stanford essentially agreeing or asking Google to be the custodian of so many centuries of knowledge and so many billions of dollars of their investments. So, you know, we're talking about several hundred years of knowledge and experience accumulation that had been accumulated by these universities, and they were asking a 6-year-old company to manage access to it, to not only be in charge of the quality of the records and images accessed, but the quality of the ability to search and manage the collection, which is a pretty stunning thing, because these universities, after all, employ hundreds, if not thousands, of librarians who've devoted their lives to these very questions. And yet, these librarians are being cut out of the decision-making process. They were not being asked to weigh in on the ethical or legal or practical or technological aspects of this project. The universities were merely saying, come on in and scan, Google. You know, welcome to our stuff. do with it what you can. And they were, of course, celebrating the fact that finally somebody was going to come in and scan these collections. Now, 6 years old in 2004. And as I said, there's no guarantee that Google's going to be around in 10 years. Probably will, right? Probably has enough cash to last 100 years. But there's no guarantee. The University of Michigan will probably be around in 10 years. It'll probably be around in 100 years. It'll probably be around in 300 years. So to me, this just seemed upside down. If we're talking about all of this heritage, we're talking about all of this knowledge, why would you outsource this project? To get it done fast? That didn't seem to me to be a good enough reason. To get it done cheaply or ostensibly for free, that's a better reason. But I wondered if it was really persuasive enough when you looked at the totality of the project and the totality of the costs. And as we've learned over nearly a decade now, the cost to these university libraries has actually been pretty high because university staff, librarians chiefly, have had to answer Google's calls whenever Google wants a particular part of the collection. Immediately the librarians have to scramble and do Google's bidding as opposed to, say, my bidding or my student's bidding. And that's been frustrating to a lot of librarians. In addition, the quo of the quid pro quo of this deal was that universities were supposed to get digital copies of their collections for their own use. And while that has happened, in other words, Google has made available those digital copies to all of the universities that are partners, and now there are more than 50 universities around the world that are partners in this project, as well as a lot of national libraries and public libraries. The problem is a lot of university councils have not given the okay for those universities to start using their collection, largely because there are still copyright liability questions that might attach to universities and that don't necessarily attach in the same ways to Google. And of course, even when there was a settlement, Google was a party to the settlement. None of the universities were. None of the libraries were. So a lot of university councils, including my own at University of Virginia, have put a stop to any reasonable use of that digital material. Now, that's not true at every university. The Hotley Trust, which is run out of Ann Arbor, but includes collections from many of the Big Ten schools and beyond, has actually made great use of the Google scans for a system that's accessible to members of those university communities and more, and I'll get to that in a moment. But in 2004, Google had been around for less time than Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston had been married. And I don't know for how long I can use that line and people will still laugh, but they actually were once married. I'm glad you remember that they were married. But that's the thing. It just seemed upside down to me. It seemed upside down to me. And I also knew that since the early 90s, libraries across the country, in fact across the world, had been engaged in a number of underfunded, disparate, uncoordinated efforts to create electronic versions of their collections, either for the sake of preservation, a backup copy, or for the sake of allowing for easier access and use at a distance. And many of these libraries and library consortia had been frustrated by the lack of institutional support. Some had received foundation support. The Mellon Foundation had been very aggressive in helping universities do this. There was actually I got interested in this question because Oxford University Press pulled me in to consult on what they hoped would be a big project. About a year before the Google thing was announced, the Google book scanning was announced, I was in a meeting with a number of other scholars, including Robert Darnton, who's now the head of libraries at Harvard and was then a history professor at Princeton, to talk about the ways that Oxford University Press and a handful of other presses might help digitize their long dormant back catalogs, the stuff that wasn't selling from many decades back, in fact, maybe centuries back, and offering those to libraries with funding from the Mellon Foundation. And once the Google project was announced, that project went away. The Mellon Foundation was no longer interested in funding such a thing because, after all, Google was going to do it. And that happened to many of these smaller digitization projects. It became really hard when Google got in the room for anyone to get any oxygen. So that was all happening in early 2005, and I started hearing a lot of complaints and concerns from professional librarians, including professional librarians at those universities where Google had partnerships. And so I started making notes about what the various issues were that were raised by this project, copyright first and foremost, but also there were huge privacy concerns. There were quality concerns. There were concerns about the privatization of the library missions. There were concerns about whether, what would happen if Google stopped caring about this, which we actually are starting to see. And so all of these concerns were influencing what I thought about it, and ultimately led to the book, The Googleization of Everything. So it really started with a concern about the library scanning project, but it grew into a much larger set of concerns. Because when I raised critical questions about Google, and I did so in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education in early 2005, I received a lot of criticism from my fellow copyright critics who could not believe that I was going after our friend Google. And I thought, well, first of all, Google's very rich. It's only 6 years old, but it's very rich and powerful. I'm just me, so what are you worried about? But don't you agree that these are issues worth following up on? And I basically heard some version of, well, strategically we have to make an alliance with Google and be on Google's side of this. We really need their help. They're the one big rich company on our side of it, and I wasn't satisfied with that. I thought that's not very helpful at all. And so I was struck by the level of adoration of Google, and in fact, one thing I noticed is for a certain subset of technophiles, Google had almost religious standing, almost deific standing. And so I started tracing that rhetoric, and I started getting into the ways that people at Google talk about Google and the ways that Google's leaders talk and about their own company and their own role in the world. And ultimately, I wanted to catalog our relationship with Google. Which by 2005 had already been pretty substantial, and that was before we had these devices in our pockets that gave us constant access to Google's services, and long before Google Maps helped us get places. So at least in a mobile fashion. So the question of Google's influence on our lives kept getting more interesting as I was trying to make sense of it and trying to write this book. And I tell you, one of the big things I learned about writing a book about Google is whatever you do, don't write a book about Google. It's crazy. It's, you have to do so much scrambling because every month there's a new thing. And every month you don't know if the new thing is actually going to matter, if it's actually going to change everything. There was a point at which I thought Google Wave was going to change everything. It only lasted a couple weeks till I actually used the thing, and then I couldn't figure out what it was for, and nobody else could either. But there were all these moments that really slowed down the process, and I had constant fear that I was going to have a book cataloging a bunch of initiatives and issues that would not be relevant by the time the book came out. In the 18-month gestation period of a book, it takes twice as long to create a university press book than it does an actual human baby. So this, and along the way, by the way, my wife produced an actual human baby, and that didn't help. So December 2005, I become a father, and that takes me out of the game. It turns out that these things need food and to be cleaned. And so the whole process of doing what I thought would be like a quick analysis of Google's influence in the middle part of the last decade turned into a much longer process, and it actually didn't appear as a book until 2011, and then, as I said, because of the book settlement, was almost immediately out of date. But hey, those are the breaks. This, by the way, is Google's mission statement, and in my early research, one of the first things I stumbled upon was this. It's not widely known. If you click around the About Google pages on any Google product, you will come across this eventually. This is the mission statement of the company. It's pretty audacious. It's pretty bold. When I came across it, I said, who asked you guys to do this? This is beyond the mission statement of a university like this one, with its deep roots and deep traditions and powerful influence on the human mind across the world. It's far beyond the mission statement of a much older university like Harvard, which actually I think Harvard's mission statement is to train the young clergy of New England. I don't think they've updated it since then. But it's, it's beyond the mission statement of my own university, the University of Virginia, which you would think with all the Jeffersonian Enlightenment, blah, 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 would actually have a big old mission statement like this. Not at all. But this mission statement has been Google's mission statement since its inception in 1998, when 2 graduate students in computer science at Stanford thought the thing up. That's pretty amazing that 2 graduate students would be that bold. No wonder they stopped being graduate students. They didn't have the requisite timidity that graduate students usually have and take through their account, right? So they ended up using this mission statement to justify so much of what they do. There's nothing about this mission statement that says Google's mission is to efficiently position ads next to search results that will generate a tremendous amount of revenue and send shockwaves through every other advertising-based medium in the world. That's what actually happened. That's not their mission statement. That was an externality, you might say positive or negative, from this mission statement. Nonetheless, this is really what explains so much of Google's activities that don't seem to pull in revenue, and most of Google's activities actually don't, including YouTube. YouTube is a huge money loser despite its popularity, despite the fact that they've been positioning ads fairly effectively, although not always appropriately. The other day, the day Lou Reed died, I tried to watch a video of one of his songs from the 1980s, and there was a required ad to view about a golf resort. I thought that was inappropriately placed. Nonetheless, Google makes a tremendous amount of money that way, but this is what it's all about. So it explains why Google's interested in doing the books project. It's why Google did things like Google Scholar. It's why Google is interested in taking photographic images of every inch of the earth if they can, and beyond if they can. But of course, this is a sort of troublesome phrase, to organize the world's information. Anyone who actually works in the world of information organization knows that's not a neutral concept. The idea of the world's information, well, that's an interesting possessive. Why do you get to do it if it belongs to the world? Make it universally accessible. Well, that's troublesome in its own sense. Is it really about universality? Is it really about accessibility? Is it only on Google's terms? What's the exchange there? This sounds very high-minded, and it's very odd that a commercial venture would have something like this as its mission statement. Nonetheless, I think it's important to consider. And when I came across this mission statement, I said there's something really interesting going on at that company. It's not that the company is doing great things or bad things. It's doing a little bit of both. But the fact that it's doing things with this in mind is really new and really interesting. Sergey Brin, one of the founders, was asked in an interview one time, what would the perfect search engine be like? And he responded, it would be like the mind of God. This is, by the way, a Google image search of the mind of God, in case you were curious. And this, I was struck by that, because that meant that it wasn't just people like Jeff Jarvis, who wrote a book called What Would Google Do, who were thinking of Google in religious terms. But actually, the founders of Google were thinking of it in these religious terms. And that, to me, sounded really fascinating, too. So I really figured I had to write a book after I came across that. Now, of course, Google is committed to benevolence. It's actually committed to something that goes beyond corporate social responsibility as traditionally taught in business schools, which, by the way, is the subject of my next book. I'm fascinated with the intellectual history of corporate social responsibility. A lot of it, my interest in it, comes out of my study of Google. And the fact that I lived in Austin for so long that I saw Whole Foods grow from a store not much bigger than this room into the behemoth that it is. So we can talk about that later. Google's attitude toward its activities in the world is one of sort of naive enthusiasm, the sense that, well, since Google is fundamentally and deeply committed to making the world better, not worse, whatever those words mean to Google, criticism of it is often answered by, well, what do you mean? We're Google. We're trustworthy. We're benevolent. We won't do evil, right? That's the general informal motto. Don't be evil. Don't Be Evil really meant Don't Be Microsoft in the early days of Google, but it's since grown to basically go beyond don't do bad things, don't do any harm, but it actually means that Google sees itself, or people who work at Google see the company as one committed to improving the world, to making the world more efficient, healthier, more knowledgeable. And when you combine that aggressive vision for making the world better, toward benevolence, with the notion that their mission statement is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible, you're dealing with a really fascinating and potentially troublesome institution. All right. But the book project, the thing that had sparked my interest in the first place, that was something I couldn't really get beyond in terms of a case study. Because in this case, we are not just talking about the world's information. We're talking about the collections purchased by university libraries, or in the case of Oxford, plundered by university libraries and their empires, over hundreds of years, at the cost of perhaps billions of dollars, that was essentially being donated to a private company, an elaborate form of corporate welfare. And the company then set up a revenue-generating opportunity with this collection, which it has since. So Google Books now has lots of opportunities to make money for Google, but it isn't that successful at it. It just has opportunities. But I started thinking, remember these ventures that were underfunded and disparate and uncoordinated? Well, we could do better than that. Maybe we could have done better than that had a bunch of people with a little bit of support, political support, foundation support, whatever, had the idea of creating something big and grand like Google did, but a few years earlier. You know, if someone had actually been able to launch that campaign, maybe we could have had a public version that could do this much better. And by much better, I meant in terms of quality. Right? Google notoriously has very poor image quality in its book collection. This is just one example of hundreds, if not thousands, of human fingers caught in the image generating, which actually it's kind of charming. It does remind us that there are human beings working on this, and I like that. It's never yet interfered with a book I actually want to see, but you know, nonetheless, Google's doing this project so quickly, and it really is about size and speed. And I wanted to raise the issues that perhaps when it comes to managing and making available and organizing this tremendous collection that took hundreds or thousands of years to accumulate, we don't need to do it in 5 or 10 years. We don't need to do it so fast that we generate images like this. The other problem with generating images of such low quality is the optical character recognition can be wonky. That's fixable too with enough different copies, which is what Google's been doing. They've been doing redundant copies from a variety of library sources. And they often ask for corrections if people see bad images. If you see an image like this, there's actually there's a button at the bottom you can click on to report the image, and they may or may not get back to it or replace it with a better version, but at least you've reported it to Google. So Google's trying to, see, I'm running into all sorts of things. Google's trying to harness the sort of volunteer efforts of people who use Google Books to clean this up. So Google's aware of this. The bigger problem is the metadata that Google has attached to these files is horribly inconsistent. Some of it's non-existent, some of it's just wrong. And that's been very well documented by people in the library community. And that's a big problem because that undermines the searchability of these documents and really kind of renders them useless in a lot of ways. And so the metadata problem, which is something that, again, had they gone into actual partnership with libraries almost a decade ago at this point, they might have been able to avoid. They might have actually learned that they had to do things step by step and pay attention to such details. But they lost out on it and rushed this system out, declaring that we now are in this new era, new revolutionary era of digital libraries. And you may have noticed if you use Google Books, with any frequency that the search system is actually really unpredictable and sometimes not very helpful. There's no clear justification for why one book is ranked above another when you do a simple text search. If you're doing a web search, you can generally understand that Google's determining the search results based on a number of factors, many of which are proprietary, many of which are trade secrets, many of which are generally well known. For instance, a page that has more incoming links to it than another page. So let's say you're looking for stories about the World Series, or articles about the World Series, or web pages about the World Series, and you search World Series, the results are going to be influenced primarily by which of those sites about the World Series have more incoming links. Those are essentially votes from the people who make links to anoint a site as being particularly relevant or useful. But then it's going to be adjusted based on geography, based on where you are. If you're doing the World Series search in Boston this week, you're going to get a very different set of results than if you're in St. Louis. I don't know what people in Chicago are getting. But they usually don't search for World Series in October. I'm sorry. It was too easy. Too easy. Right, exactly. So, but there are other factors. Google also has been tracking you for more than a decade now and knows a tremendous amount about what you want and a tremendous amount about what people in your IP number range want when they search. So if you're at the University of Chicago on the network doing a search about the World Series, Google may adjust its results based on the fact that they're going to assume you're on the South Side, therefore a White Sox fan, or they're going to look at the fact that you're searching from the University of Chicago, which has a disproportionate number of people who went to school in the Boston area and therefore give you a res. I don't know what's going to happen, but these are the sorts of factors that are feeding into Google's search algorithms. My point is, in web search, it sort of makes sense if you understand all that. It's customized, it's localized, and it's based also on the number of incoming links and thus votes for a particular site. In books, there's nothing like that. There's really nothing like that. Largely because too few people search in books, so the data about book search is not rich, not like it is with web search. But more importantly, those books don't contain links. So if in my book, as I do in almost everything I write, I cite one of Randy Picker's papers, that citation is not a hot link that Google tracks. And so it's nothing that would therefore work to help people make that association when they did a search about a particular subject and said, hey, this thing by Picker and this thing by Vaidhyanathan, maybe they're both useful to me. That's unfortunately not going to happen in Google Books. So the search system is kind of wonky too. Now this is, of course, part of a big, long narrative in human history, the dream of universal access to knowledge. So Google is not the first institution to think that maybe we should connect a lot of people to a lot of information. We've had all sorts of both utopian and dystopian visions of this. Thomas Jefferson expressed his. Borges expressed his dystopian vision of it. We've seen the great libraries of the world. This is Trinity College in Dublin, by the way, and that's, of course, the Library of Congress over there. And I do have to say I am contractually obligated to include a picture of Thomas Jefferson in every presentation I make as a University of Virginia employee. So this taps into this long held Enlightenment dream of maybe we will be better people and we will be healthier and smarter and food will taste better if we can just get more knowledge out there, if we can just get the right knowledge to the right people. Now this dream of progress attached to knowledge in a quantitative way is one that deserves a tremendous amount of interrogation. And of course, historians and cultural theorists have been engaged in that for some time. And we're not actually that convinced, obviously, that is going to solve our problems or solve any problems without creating new problems. Nonetheless, let's for a second accept that more knowledge available to people who haven't had access to that knowledge has the potential of improving their lives, if not all of our lives. Not a crazy idea, right? If you buy into the Enlightenment in any way, you can go along with that sort of modest vision of that. So then the question is, who's going to do it and how? Who's going to do it and how? Are those elements, the elements needed to build such a system, simple enough, understandable enough, settled enough, that we can trust one company to do it? Even if that company is really smart and really good at what it does. Even if that company has as its mission statement to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. That's a really big question, but it's not a question anybody got to ask in 2004 and 2005. It just happened, and university presidents around the country all celebrated. Yes, thank you, Google. Thank you for having this, for doing this for us. So I wonder if it's the best we can do. If we have a choice between letting Google organize all of this knowledge, especially the new knowledge, or a system of information chaos, one that is really bottom-up and chaotic and cacophonous. Is that really the way that we should go as we march through this next century? So what I thought I should propose was a human knowledge project, an idea that people around the world, not just in the United States, should actually take this challenge seriously. We've had technologies for some time that allow us to connect large amounts of information to large numbers of people at low or no marginal cost. Right? There's always upfront cost for getting hooked up to the networks, but low or no marginal cost. That's pretty stunning. Let's not understate the potential and the power of that. We've seen it alter our daily habits. We've seen it alter our commerce. We've seen it alter our politics. How much it has, and whether it's been better or not so great, those are questions for a shorter term conversation. But the fact is, this stuff has mattered. We have the technology to do it. It's not crazy technology. Wouldn't it be possible to envision a day in which a 12-year-old in Namibia grows up with the same information advantages as a 12-year-old in Canada or a 12-year-old in Denmark? That's not a crazy vision either. It's a potentially expensive vision, but it's not crazy. We've got the gadgets, we've got the cables, we've got the code. There are things we lack. We lack the political will to alter laws that might get in the way of that. We lack the political will to generate the revenue needed to fund that vision. But my position on this was, if we really think that that is what we should be doing as a species, if we really think it's important for us to get to the point where children all over the world have essentially equal access to useful information and high quality information, we're serious about it, then we should be serious about it. Then we should mount the sort of political campaigns, the sort of advocacy efforts, the sort of fundraising efforts that it would take to change the laws and raise the money to do it. Otherwise, we're just pretending. If we're just going to wish and hope for a company like Google to come along and build it for us on its own terms, we're wasting our time. Now, we may decide it's not worth it. That's entirely reasonable to say, this project of erasing these discrepancies in knowledge access, just not what we're up for right now. We have other issues. We have other things we need to deal with. Totally acceptable, right? This is about making political choices. This is about making choices about resource distribution. This is about prioritizing how we spend our time and money and energy. And if the idea of erasing those discrepancies is not in the top 5 in this country or the world, I'm totally okay with that as long as we actually had that debate, as long as we didn't go for the cheap fix, the alleged cheap fix, or the cheap alleged fix, right? So that was my intervention in this, to say, if you really believe in this, let's really do it. Let's really have a human knowledge project. Well, and the idea of the Human Knowledge Project should not be, I wrote, a quick fix. We should be looking at what kind of information ecosystem would we like people on Earth to have in 50 years. Let's not think about 5 or 10 years. Let's think about 50 years, because if we think about 50 years, we might get it right. We might pay attention to things like preservation, which Google has not been paying attention to. Google's scanning process is so below preservation quality, it's not even funny. When Brin wrote in the New York Times op-ed page in 2010 that one of the major reasons he wanted to do the Google Books project was because he was sure Stanford Library was someday going to burn to the ground, and then somehow Google servers would all be fine under that. I'm not sure how that would work. They seem to be on the same fault line. It struck me as so dishonest, because he should know, he probably does know, that what he has created does not replace the original materials in any reasonable way to anybody who works in library preservation. It's just not even close. So we should be thinking about the long term. We should be thinking about the fact that we are not just creating instant short-term access to this material. We're trying to create a system that can preserve the material itself and maintain and extend access to the material over a long term. It means that we have to have multiple redundant copies of everything strategically placed around the world, not on faults, in places where they won't all go dark at the same time. And we really should be focusing on quality issues and utility issues. All right. We also had to, I also thought it was important that this be a project where multiple kinds of partners and stakeholders were invited in. So it can't just be a project of the private sector any more than it can just be a project of the public sector, or a project of foundations, or a project of universities. That this project has great value if it brings in stakeholders that could include public schools, that could include national libraries, that could include universities, that could include foundations, that could include states, that could include UNESCO, which is sort of an obvious candidate to coordinate this thing, although UNESCO isn't really good at building anything but tourist attractions. So I also had a model, an explicit model that I couldn't get out of my mind. That was the Human Genome Project. You might remember that the Human Genome Project started in the 1980s as, if this sounds familiar, stop me, a disparate collection of labs in France, the US, the UK, and Japan, who were busy annotating sections of the human genome, doing so in an uncoordinated fashion, and a terribly underfunded fashion. The National Endowments, the National Institute for Health was supporting the US labs doing it, but was not doing it particularly aggressively. Then along comes this upstart company led by an incredibly arrogant, incredibly aggressive, and pretty brilliant guy named Craig Venter. And he started a company called Celera. And he came up with a technology that he called colloquially shotgunning, where he could do very quick analysis of sections of the genetic code and offer a rough map of the human genome in a 5-year period, as opposed to the 25-year period that everyone was planning for at the time. And he was going to do it, he said, for free. In other words, he was basically telling funders around the world, you can stop funding those other labs, I've got this. My company's going to do it, and then we're going to make the annotations available with certain licensing provisions. So if there are any pharmaceutical uses or therapeutic uses of this material, there will be some sort of reach-through revenue through licensing to help Celera. But for basic research, we're going to give access. There were all sorts of provisions of this. So basically, Celera was playing the Google role before Google. It was saying, we're going to do it for free. We're going to allow reasonable access to make the world better. But we also have our own stuff to worry about. So we're going to figure out a way to make money on the back end on this. And to a lot of people, it sounded really reasonable. Thank goodness we don't have to fund big science. Right? Thank goodness we don't have to fund this Human Genome Project. Well, as it turns out, the scientists who were working on the Human Genome Project could not stand the idea that one company would have that much say over the speed and nature of this data, not to mention the availability and the terms of exchange of this data. And so they went to their leaders in France, the UK, Japan, and the US, and they said, we need to coordinate a public effort, a public human genome project globally, so that we can show that Celera isn't the only way to do this, and that in fact, we have to make sure that Celera doesn't monopolize this information. And in a remarkably short period of time, with the political will, with the support of unlikely partners like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, who you would never think would go against the private sector vision, there was a massive infusion of cash into these projects and a remarkable coordination among these labs. And then in 2000, in early 2000, there was a simultaneous early publication of the database from both Celera and the public project. And so now scientists can use both projects, both databases, which is just better for everybody. It's just healthier and there's more diversity. So with that as a model, I thought, well, the best thing we can do is have a public version of what Google was trying to do. So if Google quits, or Google goes out of business, or Google doesn't do it particularly well, we're not stuck with the one way of doing things. And of course, the project has to be about all sorts of materials. It has to include all sorts of materials, audio, visual, photographic, maybe material in the sense of offering some sort of tour of material culture. It can't just be about books. And it has to have all these goals and values. It has to constantly reflect back on these specific values. These are very specific values as opposed to don't be evil or organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. Those are general values and kind of mushy values. But we need to, if we're going to do a human knowledge project, we really need to make sure that, that it realizes all of these goals. And as I said, the players would come from all sorts of parts of the world and parts of the information ecosystem. So the idea here was that libraries will not be replaced. Libraries will be networked. Libraries will become more important. Libraries as we know them will become more important, not less important, under an ecosystem that includes the Human Knowledge Project. So the library moves from being a temple to Republican values to being a temple for cosmopolitan values, or an access node for cosmopolitan values. This is what came up in Google image search when I searched for cosmopolitan. So fundamentally, the local libraries around the world will become, or would become, the sites for access. So the human beings who work in them, which are after all our most precious and highly sophisticated technologies involved in this ecosystem, would be able to guide people through the vast collection using their own local knowledge. So you wouldn't need algorithms to decide whether someone wants information about the Red Sox or the Cardinals. You could actually use human beings who live and work in that community and who are aware of the particular needs of that community and of people within that community. That's what we have now, and it works really well. The extent to which it doesn't work is only a reflection of our underinvestment in the system. But again, part of this campaign is to say, if you really care about this, it's time to put the money down. It's time to expand our network of community-based public libraries, school libraries, not just in the United States, but around the world. Now, I'm going to turn to a bunch of slides that I didn't make. So I apologize for rushing through these slides because these are slides that I borrowed from the Digital Public Library of America. The Digital Public Library of America is the first step in the realization of the Human Knowledge Project. Digital Public Library of America is real. It's not very full yet, but it's happening. I actually just got back from Thursday and Friday. I was in Boston for a big meeting of the Digital Public Library of America. I'm on the board of it. And so I'm going to tell you a bit of the backstory of this. In 2009, I gave a talk at the Boston Public Library about the Human Knowledge Project. Basically, I used a lot of these slides and a lot of the jokes. And they were stale then. And there was great buzz in the room. And that's when, for the second time in my life, I met Robert Darnton. And he said he had been working on the same sort of idea. He hadn't fully outlined it yet, but it was coming out very soon. In fact, within weeks of my presentation at the Boston Public Library, his first article in the New York Review of Books outlining the potential for a national digital library came out. So he had been working on it at the same way and same time that I had been working on it, but he was thinking in terms of the United States, and I was thinking in terms of the world. Of course, Robert Darnton is much smarter than I am, so he was actually thinking of something that was doable. He is also really well connected, and so he knew the people who could make it happen. I knew none of these things. You know, I was just writing this big nebulous idea. So since that time, since 2009, largely fueled by the outline that Robert Darnton put out there, but then later, more importantly, fueled by a number of foundations, including the Sloan Foundation and the Gates Foundation, the Digital Public Library of America actually exists. So this is its sort of intro slide, which outlines its mission. The mission of the DPLA is to bring together the riches of America's libraries, archives, and museums and make them freely available to the world. Now that's a decent mission statement, right? So it has three main elements. It's a portal for discovery that delivers students, teachers, scholars, and the public to incredible resources. It's a platform that enables for new and transformative uses of digital cultural heritage. And it's also an advocacy group and I'm not really sure why they use public option. I think that's probably a bad term to use. But basically an advocacy group to make it clear that this is an alternative to what Google has built. Now, in terms of the portal, it right now has more than 2.5 million items, photographs, manuscripts, books, sounds, moving images, and more from libraries, archives, and museums around the United States. And that collection is growing by the quarter millions every month. Every month they're getting more access to more collections. And so right now it's serving as sort of a portal and a clearinghouse to a lot of these disparate digital collections. Objects in the DPLA cover hundreds of years, and you can also use a timeline, which is a really exciting part of the platform, that you can actually use a timeline to arrange the access to these disparate collections. So you don't have to hop from the collection of the Historical Society of Los Angeles to the Historical Society of Lincoln, Nebraska, and do individual searches for stuff from a particular time period. The timeline search can actually bring up access to both, and you can see what's going on. So that's pretty exciting. You can also do geographic browsing using DPLA's technology. And as I said, these are not my slides, so I'm kind of slow on it. There are a number of curated exhibits that DPLA has access to now that are pretty exciting, mostly photographic collections. You can see a lot of what's in the collection now is heavily weighted toward the two coasts. So there's an explicit effort to try to fill in with some amazing collections in the middle of the country. That's what a lot of the DPLA efforts are going to be about in the next few months. So it doesn't just seem like a coastal thing. If you register with the site, you can create a portfolio for yourself, standard search materials. Now, the cool thing is the content for the DPLA doesn't just come from the DPLA. In fact, none of it really does. It comes from a network of more than 40 state and regional digital libraries, which have existed for some time, as I said. All underfunded, all underused, all underappreciated. So the DPLA gives us the opportunity to get a sense of the range of materials and the hard work that has been going on in these libraries and archives for decades now. Which I think is just as important in a political sense as the actual utility of the stuff. The DPLA aggregates metadata records. And so, in other words, it's building on the very solid metadata collections in all these different collections around the country. So it has some large content hubs. These included, these are some of the biggest ones. And they are the larger libraries, museums, archives, and repositories. And they provide more than 250,000 unique metadata records that resolve to digital objects. And they're committed to working with the DPLA to keep that collection lively and useful. And then there are service hubs that are largely attached to state and regional library systems. These partners offer a full menu of standardized digital services, including digitization, metadata assistance and training, data aggregation, storage services. So what that means is ultimately in every state there will be a service hub, probably in a state capital or a state library, and local collections, local historical societies, local libraries can bring their collections to those hubs and have high quality scanning done and high quality metadata services done on it. So this will allow for faster and better digitization of the disparate collections around the United States. So it's a pretty exciting idea. So small collections feed into larger collections, feed into the DPLA's entire collection, which should be accessible wherever you are in the world. So it's a really exciting model. It also has open APIs, which allow for people and private sector activities to build cool things on the DPLA collections. And that's a really exciting part. There are a number of applications that are going to be able to work with the DPLA collections very well. And there's this tool called Culture Collage that lets you search the image archive and view the results in a stream of images. And you just keep scrolling and it brings up more images. Then there's a very important part of this is, of course, that the metadata itself is freely available and usable by anybody. And so this is a very customizable and open system. It also means that the DPLA goes away, the data is still there for someone else to build on it. Let's see, yeah, anyway, that's more about metadata. We don't need to get into that. Come on. So by public option, this is the thing I'm not really happy about. I don't really like that they use this word public option. I like the public option in healthcare, by the way, but I just think it's a very confusing term to use for this. So basically what the slide says that I'm supposed to read. For most of American history, the ability to access materials for free through public libraries has been an essential part of our culture, producing generations of avid readers and knowledgeable and engaged citizenry. The DPLA works along with like-minded organizations and individuals to ensure that this critical open intellectual landscape remains vibrant and broad in the face of increasingly restrictive digital options. DPLA seeks to multiply openly accessible materials to strengthen the public option that libraries represent in their communities. So by this, the public option means libraries as a source of knowledge, as a search engine, as a search repository, so a knowledge repository. And so the DPLA is here to strengthen the institutions that we've enjoyed for so many decades and centuries, not to replace. And this is a very important position that DPLA took from the beginning, because there was legitimate concern among local libraries that the increased potential for electronic accessibility to collections was going to be used by their governing boards and their city councils and their county boards to cut their collection budget to zero. Because after all, you can just bring that stuff in through the computer. And so explicitly, this is not part of DPLA's vision of itself, nor does it really offer the opportunity, because DPLA is not providing recently published books. It may eventually enter into agreements with publishers to offer library-friendly versions of lendable books that can be accessed through tablets and other things, because right now there are a number of private vendors working with public libraries on these sorts of projects for electronic book access. None of them are particularly great or useful for people, but the DPLA may be able to provide that eventually, but it's not a replacement for other collections. All right. So I'm just going to skip through this because I think you can pretty much get the point here. So the idea, though, and the reason that the DPLA is so so exciting, is both in its utility, in its ability to connect people to collections that they didn't even know existed. Because a lot of these collections are in electronic versions and electronic repositories that are hard to find through Google. They're not optimized for Google. And if you're not looking for exactly that thing, you're not going to stumble across it using Google. As Google's search engine becomes more and more about shopping, it becomes less and less about learning and discovery. And that's really good for Google, and it's really good for shopping. But it's not necessarily good for the sorts of values and visions that libraries need to represent in our community. And so the DPLA becomes a wonderful supplement to that, by allowing people to discover stuff they wouldn't otherwise discover. But it's also a great model that institutions across the world are starting to notice. The DPLA has entered into an agreement with Europeana, which is a Europe-wide version of a digital public library. And it's also exploring partnerships with individual country libraries like the National Library of France, the National Library of Finland, to enter into these sorts of partnerships. And so the key attributes of the DPLA, its API, its electronic platform, ultimately the search technology it builds around this, those are all going to serve as experiments and models for other national, regional, and ultimately global visions of connecting people to electronic data. So it's a really exciting case study. And it's one of the reasons that after all of this, I'm extremely optimistic. I'm extremely optimistic about our ability to connect more people to better information. But I'm also cautious and realistic in the sense that I know it's not going to happen in 10 years. In any revolutionary way. But the best things are usually not built in such a short period of time. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes, right?
Yeah. Question.
Hi.
Hi. This is very interesting to me because in a prior life, about 20 years ago, I worked for a publisher in digitization of, first on microforms, so it wasn't digitization, if any of you know what that is, and then in electronic format, but now I am a children's librarian in a public library. And I think the thing that, I have a lot of questions, but I think the thing that I'm concerned about is that currently, the information that we have access to is not being provided in a way that students are being taught what to do with it. That's the challenge, is that information, I thought it was interesting when you talked about the idea of libraries being, having this improving lives. Information, knowledge doesn't even improve lives, wisdom does. And wisdom is information and time. And someone to teach you how to use it and to apply it and intention. And my biggest concern is that as we provide more and more information, that leadership, maybe not you and maybe not anyone in this room, and certainly not me, but they think that's enough. We've got what we need. Just like you said about just putting the information up there that library boards wouldn't make the decisions they make. But the challenge is that they do, just like university presidents made the decision they made with Google. The librarians didn't make that decision. Somebody else.
Well, but that's why we're fighting back. I mean, that's exactly why we're fighting back. That was the fallacy that led people to celebrate the Google project as revolutionary, as something that would enlighten the world and liberate books from their, from the binding. That was actually the way Kevin Kelly expressed it in the New York Times Magazine article in 2006, as if books are bound the way that prisoners are bound. And so I think we're mature enough now to roll our eyes at that sort of rhetoric, but we're not yet strong enough politically to show that there's a better way. And that's the real value of the DPLA, and that's, I think, why the DPLA is so exciting right now, and why foundations, even the Gates Foundation, is supporting. The Gates Foundation grant, by the way, which was just recently announced last week, is explicitly to help public school librarians learn to use the DPLA and similar resources, and help public school librarians act as agents of the DPLA in their communities, which is what really is going to kick off this thing. And so that idea that none of this happens without highly trained librarians informing the decision-making process at every point, identifying resources that should be included, and guiding users through the collection. Now, you and I can go on the DPLA right now and search for cool stuff, and it's kind of fun, but it really takes off when you have a conversation between a person doing research, whether that person is 8, 18, or 80, and a professional librarian who understands what's in the collection, in those other parts of the collection, who understands sophisticated search techniques, who understands that not everything's in this collection, you might have to go to some other collection. I mean, that's the exciting part. And so, as I said, this is a political mission now. This is a mission where we have to get beyond this idea that the sort of facile access to information fixes anything, solves anything, or gets us anywhere. Hi.
Hi. Well, when you were laying out your vision of the Human Knowledge Project, talking about it should be collaborative and focus on quality over fast or speed and so forth, do you think that in any sense Wikipedia provides a model for those aspects? I mean, I know it's not a library, it's not an archive by any sense, but it is collaborative, multilingual, and there is a constant dialogue going on about what counts as quality, what counts as something that is well-written and factual and cited and so forth. Google doesn't do that with its books.
So the Sloan Foundation funds both the Wikimedia Foundation and the Digital Public Library of America, and so there are a lot of people who are involved in Wikimedia, who are also involved in Creative Commons, who are also involved in the Digital Public Library of America. So there's a constant conversation among these institutions about ways to help mold a richer information ecosystem. Now, Wikipedia is always going to be Wikipedia. It's always going to be special. It's always going to be its own thing. And I'm often resistant to declarations or proclamations or predictions that the fact that Wikipedia is so huge and successful, it can serve as a working model to anything, let alone everything. I think Wikipedia is unique, that it is, it's one of a handful of examples in human history where anarchistic political structures created something. There aren't a lot of other examples. Free open source software is the only other example I can think of. No, that's not true. I mean, there are other examples, but that's not to say that we can't learn from both of those activities. So the real well of values and practices that inform the DPLA are actually from public librarianship, more than anything. Because it is about selecting for quality, selecting for access, preserving privacy in ways that are deep traditions in the library community. Wikipedia has invented its own version of those things and done so with a lot of arguments along the way, a lot of bitterness along the way, but remarkable success. But there are actually some things that are contributing quite strongly to Wikipedia. The very notion that we can harness input from active volunteers around the world. That's being built into the DPLA right now. That is a really important thing because there are going to be lots of passionate amateurs who want to contribute to the DPLA, contribute to the coding, contribute to the metadata, and we want to have opportunities for people to contribute in those ways. So yeah, you could say that's a Wikipedia thing, you could say that's a free software thing, you could say that's a, I don't know, any number of opportunities. But there are elements of the academic tradition that work into it, elements of the library tradition, and elements of sort of free and open source software that enter into the DPLA. It's a really good time to bring the conversation together among all those different elements of the information worlds. The DPLA is managing to do all of that.
if you're concentrating on building something slowly and carefully for the ages, does it not bother you to wait for a book to fall out of copyright before you get it? Or
Oh, okay.
are you really
So-
waiting for publishers to
Yeah. So the DPLA's policy is, of course, not to scan anything in violation of copyright. But the idea is that if you work with publishers slowly over time to convince them that some of their backlist that hasn't moved in many decades is probably, useful and valuable to the handful of people who can find it through DPLA. And this is a suggestion, it's not a DPLA policy at all. This is one of the things that I've suggested in the DPLA is that they can approach publishers, especially university publishers, and say, the stuff that you published in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which, is increasingly removed from university library shelves and pulped, a lot of that material could be digitized and preserved and may be rediscovered and reignite an interest in later, but that there's not a one-to-one replacement on the market between how you access it through DPLA. So those are the sorts of conversations that the DPLA is certain to engage in over the next few years. And so much of this is sort of incremental and improvisational too. Some university publishers will like it. I had suggested that the DPLA approach small publishers who do specialized catalogs, who might be really interested in having some of their backlists accessible, sort of to at least celebrate the work that they've done over the past 30 years. I had suggested approaching the United Nations, which produces a tremendous number of books and reports every year, and it's all public domain work too. But we need a really good way to search through all that United Nations material. That might be a good way to sort of say, hey, Digital Public Library of America now is useful around the world as well. So those are sort of ideas that are floating around, but they are, I'm not at all speaking for the DPLA management on this. They have their own to-do list that involves a lot more actual tool building in the short term and fundraising in the short term. Yes, sir.
10 years from now, when the foundation says stop supporting this, how do you see the DPLA supporting it?
Oh boy. I don't know. But I am a big fan of actual public funding for these things, because this is exactly what public funding was created for dealing with market failure. The market is not going to provide this in any useful, global, high-quality way. There is no way to do that. But that doesn't mean that the DPLA can't find other revenue means. And certainly the people who run the DPLA, and I'm, again, just on the board, so all I do is come up with ideas and they can ignore them if they want. But the people who run the DPLA are very interested in pursuing things like consulting services to local libraries, scanning services to local libraries that might generate revenue through partnerships, especially as things go global. So you can imagine the DPLA getting into some sort of revenue-generating relationship with a national library in South Africa at some point to help build a system. That's just a thought. I don't know that anybody who runs a not-for-profit organization wants to look at revenue projections 10 years in the future.
As a projection with sources,
Yeah.
better to be looking at.
Well, I'm sure they are, and I don't know. I fear the question as much as I fear the answer.
I'm afraid we're going to have to get out of the classroom for the next class coming in, but if we could invite you a couple doors down to the Cultural Policy Center if you have a few more questions for asking.
Come join us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.